December snow falls silently outside the window of a house in Ohio. It brings a stillness that wraps around Arthur, an old paratrooper of the 101st Airborne. At 96, his hands are spotted by age and tremble with every breath. He isn't holding a warm cup of tea. Instead, he is nursing a heavy object on his lap. It is a pair of battered M43 combat boots. The leather has hardened like stone, and the soles are cracked open. This is the only artifact remaining from the hell of Bastogne in 1944. Arthur's fingers trace the rough strands of burlap sacking still wrapped tightly around the ankles. It is the evidence of the days he held the line in the Ardennes forest under artillery fire. He lifts the boots near his nose. He inhales deeply. It smells of moldy leather mixed with damp mud dried from a century ago. It is not just the smell of an antique. It is the smell of fear. It is the smell of long nights waiting in desperation as the German encirclement tightened. People often remember war by the sound of gunfire. But for Arthur, the memory always begins with a numbness starting at the big toe and creeping up to the heart. He remembers the terrifying sensation when blood stopped flowing to his feet, turning pink toes into blocks of white, unfeeling ice. The soft Christmas music from the radio suddenly sounds distant. It gives way to the sound of wind screaming through snow-covered pines. The warm living room fades before his eyes. It is replaced by the blinding, painful whiteness of an ancient Belgian forest. The cutting cold rushes back. It freezes so sharp that Arthur can feel his own breath turning into white smoke right before his face. Beside him now is no longer his cushioned armchair. It is the gaunt shoulder of Jim, his buddy, shaking uncontrollably in a shallow foxhole. Space and time fracture. The longest winter of his life has begun to live again. Arthur and his unit were thrown into the crucible of Bastogne with a haste that bordered on madness. Most had arrived without overshoes or heavy coats, shivering in standard cotton fatigues that offered no more protection than paper against the biting wind. As Easy Company moved into the woods, a thick, suffocating fog swallowed the column. It dampened every sound, erasing the clatter of equipment and the murmur of voices, turning the entire battalion into a procession of ghosts drifting through the pines. Arthur looked down at his feet. He was wearing thin wool socks and standard-issue leather boots. Against snow that was already knee-deep, this wasn't equipment. It was a liability. The order given to Arthur and Jim was simple, ruthless, and non-negotiable. Dig or die. The earth was their only shield against the artillery that would surely come. They dropped to their knees, taking turns with the entrenching tool. When the shovel proved too slow, they used their steel helmets. Finally, they used their bare, bleeding fingers to claw at ground that was frozen as hard as granite. Every strike of the metal against the earth sent sparks flying into the twilight, yet they dug with the frantic energy of wild animals burrowing for shelter. When night finally fell, that foxhole became Arthur's entire universe. It was a world only 2 meters wide, damp, dark, and cold as a crypt. There were no fires allowed to break the gloom. There were no sleeping bags to crawl into. They had only their thin field jackets and the radiating body heat of the man next to them. The cold at Bastogne didn't attack with the sudden violence of a bullet. It crept slowly through every stitch of fabric, seeping into Arthur's flesh like thousands of tiny needles. He looked over at Jim. His friend's face was smeared with freezing mud, his lips a dark, bruised purple as he muttered silent prayers into his collar. In that cramped darkness, they realized the greatest enemy that night was not the German army waiting over the rise. It was the temperature dropping relentlessly below zero. Arthur's boots began to soak up the melting snow, transforming into 2 heavy blocks of ice that anchored him to the bottom of the pit. To keep the madness at bay, Arthur started talking. He told stories about his mother's roasted turkey, describing the smell of sage and onion. He spoke of his girl back home, recalling the color of her dress. He was trying to weave a blanket out of words, using memories to create artificial warmth in the void. But every time the conversation lapsed, the fear rushed back in to strangle them. The terrifying possibility of freezing solid. Arthur remembers untying his stiff laces in the dark, trying to wiggle his toes but feeling nothing. There was no pain, only a terrifying wooden paralysis. That was when Arthur understood the true definition of hell. The preachers had it wrong. Hell isn't fire. Hell is eternal ice. The sudden snap of a dry branch nearby was enough to make them both jump, their stiff hands gripping freezing rifles in panic. They settled back down, pressed against each other, back to back, chest to chest, trying to share the few degrees of warmth left in their cores. It was a strange, desperate intimacy that only soldiers on the line can understand. A place where personal boundaries are erased by the biological need to survive. Jim whispered to him, his voice trembling in the dark. "If I fall asleep, wake me up. Don't let me freeze to death." The request weighed 1,000 pounds. It turned Arthur into the gatekeeper of his friend's life. The first night passed in a blur, a haze suspended between fitful exhaustion and the stalking white death. Day by day, the German perimeter tightened around them like a noose. The snow fell ceaselessly, a white curtain that seemed determined to bury the entire 101st Airborne Division, and Arthur along with it. They were completely surrounded. An island in a sea of armor. There was no resupply coming down the road. There were no medics. And most disastrous of all, there were no dry socks to change into. Arthur looked down at his boots. Once the spit-shined pride of a paratrooper, they were now deformed, cracked, and soaked through with a black, freezing sludge. In a desperate bid for warmth, Arthur began tearing up burlap ration sacks. He wrapped the rough, scratching fabric tightly around his feet before shoving them back into the stiff leather, hoping to trap whatever meager heat his body could produce. But the cold was a patient, relentless enemy. It still won. It turned Jim's feet a bruised, mottled purple, the skin swollen so tight it looked ready to burst, losing all sensation. Trench foot. The name sounded simple, almost clinical, but to Arthur, it was a horror more terrifying than shrapnel. Shrapnel was quick. This was a slow, agonizing rot. Arthur watched through the trees as soldiers from nearby foxholes were carried away on stretchers. He saw the black, necrotic flesh that required amputation right there at the aid station, amidst the blood and the snow. A cold fear crept into his mind, sharper than the wind. Would he and Jim ever walk out of this forest on their own legs? Every morning, the first thing they did was not grab their guns. They grabbed each other's feet. Arthur removed Jim's boots with trembling hands. The sickly sweet smell of rotting flesh began to hit his nose, the scent of gangrene hovering at the edges. But he dared not show a flicker of disgust. Arthur's hands were numb, clumsy blocks of ice. Yet he patiently massaged every swollen toe of his friend. It became a ritual of survival. As holy as any prayer, he rubbed vigorously, forcing the stagnant blood to circulate back into the frozen vessels. Jim gritted his teeth against the agonizing burn of the returning flow, silent tears streaming down his grimy, unshaven face. "Hang in there, Jim. You need these legs to go dancing with Mary." His voice was raspy, stripped raw by the cold and cigarette smoke. They shared their last cigarette, passing the precious puffs back and forth. In the endless blue-gray night, that tiny spot of fire was the only color in the world. It wasn't just nicotine. It was a symbol of normalcy, a fleeting reminder of a life where men stood upright and warm, a small comfort of humanity in the wilderness. The artifact remaining today, those cracked, ruined boots in Arthur's hands, are the silent witness to the hours he spent kneeling in the cold snow. There were times, in the deep silence of 3 a.m., when Arthur wanted to give up. The cold was seductive. It whispered to him to just lie still, to close his eyes and let the eternal sleep take him. But Jim's low groans of pain pulled him back. Responsibility for his squad mate became the only anchor holding Arthur to life. Around them, German harassing fire began to fall more steadily. The rhythmic thudding of destruction, trees shattered overhead, raining jagged splinters down on them. Fresh craters appeared in the white earth, but they could not leave this foxhole. They were imprisoned in their own shelter, prisoners of war and prisoners of winter. Arthur looked into Jim's eyes. He saw the hollow look of despair, but beneath it, he saw something worse. Absolute trust. Jim believed Arthur would save him. That trust was the heaviest burden that 20-year-old Arthur had to carry. Christmas Eve, 1944, arrived in the Ardennes, not with the chiming of church bells or the stillness of a holy night, but with a fury that shook the foundations of the earth. The German artillery opened up with a ferocity that defied comprehension, raining down on the besieged perimeter of Bastogne like a monsoon of steel and fire. It was a deluge intended to break the spirit of the 101st Airborne once and for all. The ground beneath them didn't just shake. It convulsed violently, spewing geysers of frozen dirt and jagged shrapnel into the air, while the concussions tore apart the pine tops above Arthur's head, sending timber crashing down like splintered bones. The entire forest glowed in the stroboscopic flashes of the explosions, a flickering, hellish illumination that created a scene both terrifyingly magnificent and utterly horrifying. Shadows danced wildly against the snow, stretching and contracting in the blink of an eye. In the bottom of that tiny, fragile foxhole, Arthur and Jim curled into each other, knees to chests, helmets scraping against the frozen mud, huddled like two lost children caught in a primordial storm. The deafening blasts compressed the air around them, slamming against their chests with such force that every breath became a difficult, broken gasp for oxygen. Amidst this orchestral chaos of destruction, Jim suddenly screamed. There was a high, jagged sound that cut through the roar of the barrage. It wasn't from shrapnel or a bullet. It was the agony of his own body betraying him. Severe cramps seized his legs, locking the muscles in a rigid, agonizing grip as the paralysis of the cold deepened. My legs, I can't feel my legs. Jim yelled in panic, his voice cracking with hysteria as he tried to thrash about in desperation, kicking at the dirt wall. Arthur knew instantly what was happening. He knew the physiology of the freeze. If Jim lay still in that position, crying in the fetal curl, the blood flow would block completely. The tissues would die. His feet would be dead, black things before the sun rose on Christmas morning. Ignoring the shells exploding right over the lip of the foxhole, metal whining through the air like angry hornets, Arthur lunged up. He pinned Jim to the bottom of the hole with his own body weight to keep him below the spray of lethal metal. With frantic, fumbling hands, Arthur ripped at the laces of his friend's sodden boots, tearing them open and tossing them aside into the mud to reveal feet that were terrifyingly stark. They were white, waxy, and cold as blocks of carved cemetery stone. Without a second of hesitation, Arthur pulled up his field jacket. He dragged up his wool undershirt and grabbed Jim's frozen, lifeless feet. pressing them directly against his own stomach, against his own bare, warm skin. The sensation was shocking. The cold from his friend's feet transferred to him instantly, sending a violent thermal shock down his spine that made his teeth chatter. It felt like pressing a block of dry ice against his tender flesh, a burning, biting cold that seared him, but he did not let go. Arthur used his own core body heat, the last reserve of warmth he possessed, to warm his squad mate. Willingly turning his own body into a living furnace to stave off the frost, his hands were relentless. They continuously massaged Jim's calves, digging his thumbs deep into the rigid muscles, pressing hard on the pressure points to force the veins open, ignoring the clumps of dirt and pine needles raining down on his helmet from the blasts above. "I got you, Jim. I got you. I got you," Arthur repeated over and over. He chanted it like a mantra, a prayer to a deaf god, using his voice to drown out the scream of the bombs and the terror in his own mind. He could feel Jim's erratic, rabbit-fast heartbeat pressed against his back, trembling with shock. And simultaneously, he felt his own steady heartbeat hammering against the soles of his friend's feet, trying to pump rhythm back into the silence of the flesh. It was the moment the boundary between two human beings vanished completely. There was no longer an Arthur and a Jim. In that hole, under that fire, they were just a single unit of life, fighting the void. Blood trickled steadily from Arthur's lip, where he had bitten down to endure the bone-chilling cold that was draining the heat from his stomach, turning his own skin numb. He felt the cold invading his organs, slowing him down. But he refused to break contact. But then, a small miracle happened. Arthur felt it against his belly. A tiny, involuntary movement. One of Jim's toes twitched slightly. Then another. It was faint, barely a flutter, but it was there. Life had returned. The hot, stubborn blood of youth had won the battle against the Ardennes winter. Jim broke down sobbing. He didn't speak. He just wept, hot, grateful tears falling onto the back of Arthur's shoulder, mixing with the dust and the grime of war. They lay there all through Christmas Eve, under a burning, apocalyptic sky, locked in a posture that was strange, intimate, and profoundly sacred. Arthur doesn't remember when the shelling finally stopped that night. The silence may have returned at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. He cannot recall. He only remembers that he didn't let go of his friend's feet until the gray light of dawn crept through the shattered trees. The next morning, when the snow finally stopped falling, they sat up and looked at each other. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and haggard, aged 10 years in a single night. But they were whole. Jim looked down at his feet. They were no longer the pale white of the grave. They were pink again, ugly and swollen, but alive. He looked up at Arthur with the wide, glassy eyes of a man who had just been reborn, a man who had stood at the precipice and been pulled back. No words of thanks were spoken. In the face of such an act, language was entirely superfluous. To say thank you would have cheapened the sacrifice. Arthur retrieved Jim's tattered, stiff boots from the mud. He carefully helped his friend put them on, guiding the tender feet into the leather. He tied the laces with fingers that were still trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. That simple act, kneeling in the snow, tying another man's shoelaces, held more love, more devotion, and more truth than any expensive Christmas gift wrapped in papers ever could. In the absolute hell of Bastogne, surrounded by death and cruelty, Arthur had preserved something more precious than a military victory. He had preserved his humanity. He realized then, with a clarity that would stay with him for the rest of his life, that he could kill the enemy. He could endure the gnawing hunger. He could sleep in the ice. but he could not bear to see his friend crippled. That night became their private secret, a silent pact signed with warmth and pain, a memory locked away in the fortress of their minds. Artillery could plow the earth, it could shatter the forests, and it could break bodies, but it could not tear apart the bond between the two soldiers in that foxhole. The sky over Bastogne, which had hung for weeks like a leaden lid sealing their tomb, finally cracked open. Through the breaking clouds, C-47 transport planes appeared like aluminum angels, their bellies opening to drop canisters of ammunition and rations that floated down on colorful silk chutes. On the ground, the vibration changed. The terrifying thud of incoming artillery was replaced by the heavy, rhythmic rumble of American Sherman tanks. General Patton and his Third Army had done the impossible. They had punched a hole through the iron ring of the siege, opening a corridor to drag Arthur's unit out of hell. The order to move out was given. It should have been a moment of triumph, but it heralded the final physical test. They had to walk out of the woods. When Arthur tried to stand up from the foxhole for the first time in weeks, his legs felt alien. They were numb, heavy logs that seemed to belong to a stranger. As he forced his weight onto them, the nerves woke up with a vengeance. Every step was torture. It felt as if the soles of his feet had been stripped away, leaving him to walk on thousands of shards of broken glass. But Arthur walked. He put one agonizing foot in front of the other, and Jim walked beside him. He was limping, his face pale and drawn, but he was upright. He was steady on the legs he had saved. As they trudged along the frozen road, a convoy of 6X6 medical trucks began to pass them, driving the opposite way toward the rear hospitals. They were open-back trucks, filled to capacity with the wreckage of the division. Arthur looked up, and the sight froze the breath in his throat. The trucks were piled with soldiers wrapped in stark white bandages. He recognized faces. Boys from Able Company, men he had shared cigarettes with in training. Now, they lay motionless on stretchers, their blankets flattened ominously where their boots should have been. Their feet had been amputated at the shin, surrendered to the gangrene that had thrived in the wet cold. Arthur saw the empty, hollow look in their eyes as they stared up at the passing trees. These were young men who would never run after a baseball again. They would never dance with their wives. One hint, a profound, suffocating silence enveloped Arthur. It was the crushing weight of gratitude mixed with a sharp, acidic dose of survivor's guilt. The question burned in his mind, unanswerable and cruel. Why us? Why did we keep our feet? Why were he and Jim lucky enough to walk away? While those men, just as brave and just as deserving, lost a part of their bodies to the ice. Arthur looked down at his own tattered boots as he walked. The layers of rotten burlap he had wrapped around them were unraveling, falling off in frozen chunks into the snow. Those boots were ruined, ugly, and falling apart. They had failed to keep him warm, but they had succeeded in the only task that mattered. They had brought him home. Jim drifted closer. He didn't say a word. He just tapped Arthur gently on the shoulder. We made it. They walked out of the Ardennes, leaving behind a landscape of shattered pine trees and foxholes filled with memories and blood. The snow was still white, pristine in the distance, but in Arthur's eyes, it was no longer beautiful. It was a giant shroud. The sound of the tank treads grinding on the frozen road was harsh, a mechanical screech of metal on ice. It was the sound of freedom. They paused to share their last piece of bread. It was rock hard, stale and cold, but as they chewed, it tasted better than any gourmet meal served on fine china. As the dry crumbs went down his throat, Arthur made a silent promise to himself. He would never, ever complain about the cold again, as long as he could still feel the wiggle of his 10 toes. The war might have ended on paper for this unit, but the war with the memory of that winter had just begun. WWII, Jim and Arthur finally separated at the assembly area, drifting into the chaos of reorganization, each carrying their own invisible wounds. The last time Arthur saw Jim there, the boy was standing tall near a jeep. He turned and waved goodbye, shifting his weight easily on sound, healthy legs. That image imprinted itself on Arthur's mind more deeply than any shiny medal. Arthur realized then that he had saved a small part of the world simply by saving the feet of a friend. Back in the quiet living room in Ohio, the fire in the hearth has finally died down. It leaves only a bed of glowing embers, pulsing with a fading orange heat that barely illuminates the room. Arthur, now a silver-haired old man, his hands spotted with age, lifts the pair of cracked, misshapen boots. He places them gently back into the oak box, handling them with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Over the decades, his wife had tried to throw them away many times. She complained about the musty, earthen smell of old rot that seemed to cling to the leather and fill the closet. But Arthur always stopped her with a sad, knowing smile. She didn't understand, and perhaps no one who wasn't in that foxhole could ever truly understand. Those boots were the only tangible proof that he had survived the impossible. Jim passed away a few years ago, taken not by a bullet, but by the slow, natural drift of old age. At the funeral, standing over the open casket, Arthur didn't focus on the grief. He clearly remembered the image of his friend resting in peace. With both legs intact, he saw the victory of their struggle. Now, every Christmas, Arthur doesn't pray for material gifts. He sits in his armchair and silently gives thanks for the simple miracle that his feet can still feel. He slides his bare feet against the thick wool carpet, rubbing them gently. He cherishes every rough texture, every tickle, every nerve impulse sent to his brain. It is a sensation he never takes for granted. The war took away Arthur's youth. It stole his innocence in the forests of Belgium, but it left him with an indelible lesson about the true value of warmth. He understands now that brotherhood isn't about reciting oaths or saluting flags. Brotherhood is the willingness to press your friend's freezing, dying feet against your own bare stomach. The boots resting in that box aren't just old leather and rusted nails. They are a monument to a friendship forged in ice, stronger than steel. Arthur looks out the frosted window. The snow begins to fall again, drifting down white and silent, just as it did in 1944. But this time, the old paratrooper is not afraid. He is home. He knows he completed his mission. He kept his promise to the boy in the dark. He didn't leave his buddy behind, and he brought it all back home. The veteran closes his eyes, listening to the winter wind whistling against the glass, and smiles alone in the darkness. The memory of Bastogne is forever cold, but Arthur's heart, strangely, feels incredibly warm.